great that we've got Paul Frijters presenting this time. I mean, Paul's a long-time contributor to many fields, but he is actively involved in this behavioural public policy field as well, and he's a regular attender of these seminars. So we appreciate you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks for agreeing to lead today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, Adam. And yeah, very happy to sort of, try this format. This is a new one for me, so bear with me as I try something new as well. Can everybody see the screen? Gigerenzer, democracy, AI, and other things. Hello? Can everybody see the screen? You give some feedback, Adam?
Yes. Yeah, it's fine. It's good.
Excellent.
Can you see him? I put my thumb up, but maybe you can't see me now. But yeah,
okay, I'll put it small so that you can all see the screen now. Okay, so let's get cracking. So Adam gave me the sort of the demand that we should talk about others and preferably challenging. So bring out wide implications or something. So I dug up Gigerenzer and the Helbing et al. 2019 papers, and we'll talk about that. But I have a couple of caveats. One is I'm not an expert on Gigerenzer, and he's here himself, so you can ask all the difficult questions about his work of himself. I only heard of him 6 months ago, so I apologize for that too. When basically a fellow behavioral economist, Lionel Page, you may know him, he wrote a book on rationally irrational. We discussed about his work, and he remarked that I reminded him of Gigerenzer in terms of my opinions. And after reading some of it, it does remind me of myself in terms of how I think about these things. And so I'm going to argue some profound opportunities and implications of his line of thinking, plus the core elements of his friends and Helbing et al. As I see them. They may not be as he sees them, so caveat emptor. And I also want to talk briefly about the prescience of sort of looking forward to events that was shown in Helbing et al. So what is the essence of Gigerenzer? And this is basically his slides, though I've added bold. He says 3 things. Take uncertainty seriously, by which he means think of a world in which you don't have probabilistic distributions, you don't know what the model looks like, you truly don't know where you are, what you're doing, and what's going on. He then says, well, in those situations, our standard toolkit makes no sense, and heuristics are the best one can do. And so the second is take heuristics seriously, right? Model them, test them in various situations. And he points out a couple of implications that you get in heuristics, which you wouldn't get in standard models, like less is more and social following behavior. And his third point is that he basically talks about ecological rationality, which is that notion that people's behavior, but also their mental functioning, is fit for the particular environments in which they operate, their roles, and which they interact. And so you got to see them within an ecology being rational. They might be extremely irrational in another ecology, but that is then often not the point. And then he says, well, you then get fast and frugal type things. So this is one of his slides. Gert was very friendly to lend me some of his slides. So I've copy-pasted one of these. This is what he thinks of the adaptive toolbox. And he's got 5 different types of sort of cognitive tools in there. And I found the most interesting one, the social one, whereby we outsource a lot of our thinking to others, if you like. We are cogs in a social machine. And so he thinks of imitation, word of mouth, wisdom of crowd effects. And of course, what we now know from the mirror neurons, we almost have an ability to sort of quickly mimic others and even mimic their view of the world very early on in life. Then some additional elements, which I'm not quite sure what Gert himself uses, but which were quite prominent in the paper, which I took, was slightly more social. So the paper talks about group intelligence, increased by social diversity. So the notion there is that many eyes see more than one, but of course that also needs habits of taking whatever the other eyes see seriously as well. There's a cultural genome aspect, whereby things like guilt or shame are themselves cultures that evolve, that are fit, if you like, for particular environments, but where one can think of more things. And they even talk about a cultural matrix to typify societies, a little bit like Hofstede. And they put in the phrase pre-programmed catastrophe. So they warn of AI and big data as sort of being a potential threat to our way of living in 2019. And they particularly warn of big nudging. So the main reason I like it is that I think it's a very cognitively realistic way of viewing humanity, but also the interactions between humans. And so I would like to add to that my stylized understanding of parts of basic cognition in neuroscience, whereby if you think of a person who's just viewing the world in their everyday life, they're essentially having their brain construct a kind of a moving picture, and it's got colors and images and emotional associations and sounds, but it does this out of sort of breaking down an awful lot of different inputs and putting it together. And there are some salient aspects of that. One is that much of what we think we see is made up. So if we blink, we don't see black because our internal video keeps up going. So we basically are fooling ourselves every time we blink so as not to distract us, probably. We add colors, and that is something our minds do, but not all our minds do. We extrapolate from a very small bit of the table, we see the whole table. We use emotions as motivations. So we think we can grab something, we get emotionally aroused in order to motivate us probably to do something. We do subconscious threat assessments, so we can be afraid without even knowing what we're afraid of because part of our mind has already analyzed it. There's also a kind of uncertainty resolution principle going in, whereby we experience reality as certain, certainly a chair there, certainly a cup, but in many instances our mind is in two minds, but it sends to the conscious a very clear and concise picture without any notion of uncertainty. And the McGurk effect is a good example of how people can then be fooled. And social expectations, right? Well, what we see is largely influenced by what we think others want us to see or expect us to see even. And there are all kinds of experiments whereby even our very perceptions are very largely influenced and determined by how we are in social space, if you like. And so there's no such sense in which, I view the world as it is. That sort of begins to be absurd. We're sort of self-storytellers. And so the explanation of that kind of neuroscientific basis is that we do deliberate story building in order to aid our decision making. And this story building differs for every individual, highly path dependent, highly socially related. So very much fits this notion of ecological rationality that Geert champions. And there's an aspect there of minimization of cognitive load there, which is also one of Geert's themes, right? You outsource a lot of thinking to groups. That can include morality. Geert has a funny paper on, I think, moral satisficing, truth, opportunity, self-images. All these kind of things are things we make up as a group. Now, some immediate implications. One is that if you think then of particularly the economic concepts of individual rationality or on truth-based morality, morality based on seeing the world as it is, then you immediately realize that's neither a default nor possible. That's not a human way in which one can experience the world. We're not able to be remotely rational the way that it's sometimes described. And even if you think of as if rationality requires a really choreographed internal thinking, it would take you years to even approach something like individual rationality as you see in economic textbooks, and thereby becomes more a normative statement rather than a positive statement that in circumstances it makes sense to put in these years of investments. And it, of course, opens up a whole other field of, well, what is a smart way to think? What is a smart way for groups to think? And that's the adaptive toolbox. Also, you realize that consistency in decision-making is neither possible at the human level nor optimal, right? Quicker heuristics get you to much better places on average. It's far too much cognitive load to even try to be consistent. And of course, it means there's no escaping context then in dynamism. If we are set up to behave quick and fast and get to reasonable decisions in various circumstances, then, well, those circumstances matter. So it is ecological rationality. Then if I think of the general implications, apart from sort of, knocking down a couple of straw men, which unfortunately refuse to die over time, then I see a huge market for this type of thinking. Right? I think that this could be a discipline in itself that in a way envelops economics. Economics, to a certain extent, is smaller than this, right? I find that a non-judgmental approach, non-utopian, right? There's no obvious way in which something is already the best way to think. That's more something that you have to discover. And you think of humanity in that sort of evolving cognition supporting luggage. Also, it gets you away from static stories, right? You no longer find the world of principles and foundations and laws all that interesting anymore. You indeed start thinking of an adaptive toolbox or indeed, being smart in a dynamic sense. And when looking for support, amongst others who write about this, I found particular feminist critique interesting, that they criticize a lot of both moral philosophy and economics as being too Cartesian, which I think what they mean is, too much based on sort of foundations, individual rationality principles, that sort of thing. And a nice phrase that fits that is a book called The Myths We Live By. But there is a warning here, as Gerd says, you have to take uncertainty seriously. I think that that's psychologically very difficult for many people. So I do think that this is an approach requires being comfortable with never resolved uncertainty, something where you never get an answer. And for many people, that's very difficult to live with, I think, as an individual. You've got to be quite sort of emotionally stable and sort of happy almost to be able to do that. And you've got to be able to live without undoubted foundations. And again, I know many very smart people who just can't do that. But if you can do that, then I think it's a very powerful approach. And if I think of the core market, where is the field open? Where are the jobs for people who go in this kind of direction? Well, I think that the business school world is really ripe for the taking. This standard economics doesn't really have much inroads there, but what they talk about is a form of group cognition. So you think about management, leadership, marketing, strategy. These are all forms of ecological rationality and group rationality out of, heuristic thinking and others of these toolbox. And I think there's also a job there in terms of organizational design, right? If you think of groups, as it were, as entities which you can make smarter via all kinds of tricks and heuristics, well, then there's a question of figure out which heuristics and which circumstances, what kind of problems. And so at all levels, you can speak of the design of a cognitive infrastructure of groups and large organizations. And I'm putting in some names there which will be familiar to people from the business world: challenge partners, rotation systems, mentorship systems, deliberate systems. So that gets you to democracy, ecologies, top-down, team-based production. And becoming an expert in what they're good at, how they function, how to set them up, and how to set them up in different cultures. That could just be a job, right? That's the organization builder. And we nowadays think that that's a large job for managers, but why not be specialists in that? And I also see some role for new creativity here, right? Particularly if you're in this sort of social emotional realm where you see things as guilt, as just an invention. You think, okay, what else can I come up with, right? If somebody invented souls, how about I invent something totally new in that space? And this gets you tools for democracy, because democracy then starts to be viewed as a form of group cognition. And so that also makes this kind of thinking a deep reply to the challenge of AI, in the sense that you're thinking of optimizing what you can get out of humans and groups of humans. So you're trying to optimize local and national human cognition and agency, so as to be still a match for what AI can do. Then a few AI relevant thoughts. One is that what's good news, if you like, that we have as a species both individual and social heuristics, which make us far smarter than we could ever be if we try to be, as it were, individually rational. The second thing, which you might think is negative, is that AI, of course, might discover sets of individual and social heuristics which are better than what we've come up with so far in our evolution, and we don't know. Right? It is the case, as Gerd has noted also in his correspondence with me, that AI thinks in a very different way and does very well in closed systems, but has difficulty with open systems. In that sense, complexity makes the AI problem more and more difficult. And the AI that we have is still of the supercomputer variety, and not of this almost sort of cog in a moving group dynamic situation, which is really what humans are. Humans are an ecology with each other. In that sense, they're not static. They keep changing. And AI doesn't yet think like that. It's not yet a herd, if you like. And so it may take a long time for AI to hit upon the tricks that we have, but I personally think that will happen. And Gerd gave a reference, how to stay smart in a smart world. Then I want to talk a little bit about the article, because I thought it was a very prescient article itself. It really drew my attention. And I found it, to be honest, just by looking at, okay, which of the recent articles that Gerd wrote was cited a lot. I thought that's probably the most interesting one. So I went for the wisdom of crowd, and this was the most cited one, I believe, in 2019. So it was relatively new. And it essentially sort of warns us. It's like a warning article. It says, well, okay, we're in 2019, and AI can, with big data, be abused, right? Might be abused by governments becoming essentially fascist, highly bureaucratic, and enslaving the rest of us. Or we may actually sort of learn to use its benefits and organize ourselves better so that we get what they call in this diagram democracy 2.0. And I thought that was a very appealing idea, that we might sort of go off a cliff, both cognitively and organizationally. Now, if you then ask me my opinion, or at least how do I see the last 4 years, then what they warn of, if they talk about this feudalism 2.0, they talk about automated totalitarian society, they talk about big nudge, they talk about propaganda and censorship. These are all direct quotes. So essentially, less autonomy, less information agency, worse outcomes. You might say that was their prediction. If you then think, well, what's happened the last 3 years? I bring to your mind the EU Digital Services Act, which is about as close to propaganda and censorship as you can get. Large tech companies have to sort of show almost in Soviet style how many people they've censored. Lockdowns and school closures is sort of the textbook example of a big nudge. And a particular example of that is that several doctors in various NHSs around the world were fired for informing patients about vaccine risk, which was, of course, their oath, but that's now been replaced in various countries by mandated health advice that the government gives out via an agency. We've seen declining life expectancy, big bureaucracy, including a large increase in mental health problems. We've seen increased obesity rates, reduced cognitions. The PISA results are quite dramatic for much of the West. We see increased surveillance, larger government debt. And so I think there's much to be said for the argument that we've fallen exactly off the cliff that the Helbing 2019 article warned us about, for exactly the reasons they talked about. So basically, it could be done now by the powers that be. And so it was done when a particular emergency excuse came up. If you then look at, okay, what did Helbing 2019 say should be done? And if I look at what, as it were, the groups that I'm now strongly associated with and put a lot of my time in, it almost reads like we're sort of reading our own history of the last 3 to 4 years. So it talks about basic rights of citizens. I've co-founded Australians for Science and Freedom. We are there to champion informed consent, once again, critical education. Talks about education more focused on critical thinking. I just co-founded an organization called Nova Academia. And we now have a place where we're going to actually try and do this, including a social ecosystem. Talks about a digital nervous system run by the citizens. The last time I was giving this lecture, I was advocating for citizen juries, so citizen-led job decisions, whereby you decide as a jury who's going to be the top of various parts of the civil service. One jury, one job. Talks about digital democracy. That's, again, that similar idea of citizen juries, and less paternalism, less nudging. It's, of course, exactly the opposite of where things have gone, more informed. There is now a whole ecosystem, which I'm part of, which you might think of citizen journalism, anti-corruption books, books on censorship, that sort of thing. And risk-savvy citizens. I'll remind you that the early actual cost-benefit analyses of lockdowns were highly negative of that, and were sort of kept under wraps by governments eager for the cliff, if you like. So I will leave it at that. I have an awful lot more slides I can talk about, but you can ask me and probably also Gert for your comments, your thoughts.
Great. That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Paul. That's great. And it's amazing how much your stuff you're doing actually as well on that last slide. I think it would be polite. I think it would be polite to let Gert just come in first if he wants to.
Absolutely.
Given that the conversation is on his work. So Gert, did you want to say anything at this point?
Oh, I'm much impressed how Paul weaved together basically his own ideas, his own philosophy of life, with my attempts to get psychologists, economists, and philosophers and others take uncertainty seriously. So I won't say much more at this point, but I would like to leave the others to comment.
While people are putting their hands up, can I just ask you one question, Gert? And this is just your impression, really. I mean, do you get the sense that, the interest in the program of work that you've been advocating for around uncertainty, do you think that that's gaining more and more traction over time? Do you get that sense?
Yeah, I do. So, and in various fields, for instance, there is even macroeconomics. There's a paper by Joe Stigler, Nobel laureate, with Giovanni Dosi, first author, on showing that simple heuristics that we have shown to work, like recency heuristic, just relying on one data point, is in an uncertain, volatile market, predicts demand better than traditional market economic models. So the point is that there are many, in various areas, researchers are putting the ideas, heuristics test, because these heuristics you can actually formalize and test them, and then they can see themselves whether they work. And the important point is also the study of ecological rationality gets now an impulse, and people ask the question, not whether something is rational or irrational because I think so, but which heuristic works in what environment, and can we prove that, and can we show that? So I can give you a number of examples. So just to be short, the Bank of England has developed fast and frugal trees for predicting banking, so problematic banks, and it's a highly uncertain world, but using standard statistical models which you get nowhere. We have in education, for instance, in Germany, there is now teaching of certain easy to understand model for Bayesian inference, so in limited situation, and in medicine, of course. So heuristic rules have been used all the time and are now being formalized.
Okay, thanks, Gerd. So I think how we'll proceed then, we've got a couple of hands up now. The questions will be directed, or comments directed, to Paul. Given that it's Gert's work, what we'll do is that at the end of the seminar, we'll come back to Gert again at the end to see if he wants to respond to any of the points. But on a point-by-point basis, since Paul's leading the seminar, we'll put Paul in the chair, so to speak. So, Nick, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so thanks very much, Paul and Gerd. Obviously, I'm very sympathetic to many of the things you were saying. One of the things I wanted to ask about, or just to prod a bit, is this question of foundations. Because certainly for me, there's a really very big distinction between a reliance on solid foundations and a belief in the utility of the concept of rationality. And I tend to think of foundations as a total non-starter, or rather the idea that there's a privileged set of foundations that we can say, oh, these things for sure are true, or these reasoning principles are definitely right. And we then proceed on that basis. I think that is I think that's a sort of thing, that's an idea that's been abandoned since the demise of logical positivism, really. But it does live on, of course, in psychology and economics and elsewhere. But on the other hand, rationality is a bit broader than that, isn't it? I mean, for example, as soon as we start to reason about something, we're reasoning about, in discussing or getting our citizens' jury together or anything, or even if the brain is trying to integrate different bits of perceptual information, we have to have some kind of, often rather qualitative way of thinking, well, these arguments seem to point to this, and this seems to point to that. And once we start to try and study that and think about it, it seems like we find ourselves sort of inexorably driven, and maybe this is a mistake. Maybe Gert would say it definitely is a mistake. Maybe it's a mistake that we find ourselves inexorably driven to try to build some kind of rational framework to explain this. And of course, those frameworks are always very partial. I mean, we only have logics and mathematics for a tiny fraction of human reasoning. Most of it is just too difficult. But I suppose my question is, do we see that as sort of inevitably just a sort of pointless process, and we should just be going this much more localized heuristics approach, or should we be maintaining the idea that there's some principles of rationality which we're not trying to ground anything, they're just trying to relate different bits of information together. So a tiny thought on that is, of course, you're completely right. Consistency is totally infeasible. Even trivial propositional logic formulae, you can't figure out if they're consistent. So for human knowledge, it's absolutely hopeless. And that's something, again, that is very important and often not really, we all know it, but we often sort of pretend that it's not true. But it's still the case that when we find inconsistencies, which we mostly don't because we are massively inconsistent and we can't see it, but when we do find them, we often try to become less inconsistent. And that is a big driver of behavior. So, and thought too. So, often in ways that seem sensible or not sensible. Sometimes cognitive dissonance reduction might seem to lead us to do strange things. But at least, I suppose our general plea is or thought is that do we want to throw away the idea that cognition is quite often concerned with the integration of information, and rather than just taking bits of information and doing local things with them, like saying, I apply this fast and frugal rule. So yeah, I'm just interested in your thoughts really, and obviously Gert's too.
Yeah. Let me answer. These are big topics, Nick. So I guess I have now come to view, as it were, the textbook notion of rationality as a whole set, you might say, of heuristics in one go. And you might say that the basic presumption in the textbook notion of rationality is that neither observation nor analysis costs any actual effort. And so it's really sort of uneconomic at a certain moment, because you put in two goods with a price of zero, and then you always end up at something absurd. So if I were to try and define rationality, I think it's got a couple of things in it. One is that you have to observe the world as it is. Well, that is already an impossibility. We're not set up for that. We sort of have to put in enormous effort to sort of try and deduce. The second is that you sort of have a whole causal framework in mind. Well, if I do this, then I'm going to get that outcome. If I do something else, I'm going to get that other outcome. And so that requires you to analyze an awful lot of what ifs and do so in an unemotional way. The third is that you have to know exactly what it is that you want, so that you can evaluate all those various outcomes that you've come to in your mind. Now, some people know roughly what they want out of life, but really in all 500 dimensions, you know exactly what you want. Such people don't exist, and it makes no sense to run around with that sort of stuff in your head, right? And then you optimize your path, right? Instead of going for much more simpler heuristics, like, well, let me just ask someone else what's sensible. Let me just do what my parents told me, right? So if you then ask the question, which I think is sort of the sensible one, well, in what circumstances it makes sense to behave a bit like that? And where I also think a little bit this economic sort of rationality idea came from, then I'm thinking of the accountants. I'm thinking of double bookkeeping. I'm thinking of very large projects whereby you're spending billions of pounds. And in that case, yeah, if you've got a lot of time, you've got a lot of prep, then you can afford to sit back and try as best as you can to indeed reason through things. But each of these reasoning things is often a set of tricks in themselves, right? Even deliberating with others means that you have to have empathy, you have to put yourself in their mind. You're nearly always mixing models of the world, because everybody else's model of the world is somewhat different. And then you have to have some sort of reasonableness and say, well, I think there's a point that I hadn't think of that, almost as it were lists of effects, if you like. And then you come together at a new view, which you can't put in a single model either, usually, and that's just one part of the problem. So those two are sort of things that I am now thinking of as it were, social hacks, I like to call them, and Gerd seems to prefer the word heuristics. So in that sense, this whole notion of rationality stops being either a benchmark or even sort of useful as a figment. It just starts being a set of prescripts. It starts being a whole set of things, which you think, well, in those particular circumstances makes sense. But let's neither think that people think like that, nor that in almost any but very exceptional case, it actually makes sense to try and do that, right? Just because the costs are so phenomenally high to attempt that. That's sort of my view on it.
No, that's nice. So can I just add one thing? So an interesting analogy in my mind is mathematics, where mathematics is sort of the paradigm, rational, consistent body of knowledge. But on the other hand, individual mathematicians are always doing heuristics, and you can't do mathematics by sort of heroic analysis of all possible proofs. So, it's an incredibly heuristic business, and mathematicians and the like are always getting terribly confused and making terrible mistakes, and using heuristics don't work. But overall, but of course there's this game they're playing against each other, where somebody suggests a proof and someone finds a hole in it, and someone else repairs the hole, and someone finds a hole in that proof, and blah blah blah. But the end result is actually surprisingly stable, and it would be very hard to understand what mathematicians were doing if one said, "Oh, it's you really want to take a fast and frugal approach to mathematics. You don't be worrying about all this mathematics with all its logic and so on, and its beautiful consistency." But I think and if you're just studying a mathematician sort of moment by moment as they stare at the page and try to do some algebra, that would be appropriate. But there is still a role for the coherent body of knowledge. Trying to articulate that, if you're trying to understand what mathematicians are doing, because otherwise it's kind of it's all just a sort of set of unrelated hacks.
But I'd have a counter to that, right? I mean, I agree that there's some sort of aesthetics in mathematics, but of course, they don't have this full set of assumptions. They don't work on the notion that you know what you want. In that sense, are working towards a goal. They're just creating a particular type of beauty, if you like, right? And that is almost, as it were, a process of finding out the world as it is in mathematics land, and a social process of weeding out mistakes and that sort of thing. But if I would want to understand what a lot of mathematics is about, or to be able to do these proofs, I actually want to be taught the heuristics. And so when I was taught mathematics, you get taught, as it were, the end result, but not the process via which to get there. And I was hopelessly confused as what the heck, what rules of thumb are they following? Well, it sort of looked as if this emerged by magic, and you all had to sort of worship the mathematician who came up with this sort of divinely inspired idea. So I thought there was a lot of smoke and mirrors in how mathematics was presented, and I would have liked to have it presented as a set of heuristics that you follow and have all the humanism in there, if you like, because then that's also easier to learn. So I felt it gets taught very poorly because it leaves out the actual process via which you come up with anything, right? So I think to a certain extent you were making my case. Okay, this is not how we do it. This is how we pretend we've done it. Let's stop the pretense. What's the use of this bloody pretense?
Okay, that is very interesting points. Maybe we'll come back to some of those. Bob, you're muted, Bob. You need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, I just wanted to put in a plug for my hero Tom Schelling, who was writing very similar thoughts in 1960, and he's saying, I mean, one of my favorite quotes from him is he's trying to reorient game theory. He says game theory is as it's written, and in many ways as it's still written, is based on a priori principles of rationality. And he says, my book is about rationality, and obviously, the kind of problem he's talking about is choose a place in New York City to meet another person who's been asked the same question, and the answer is in the Times, information booth, Grand Central Station. And he says, well, my book tells you how to solve these problems. And he says, well, what you're doing when you've read my book, you'll be able to solve these problems better than you could before. And you'll be able to solve these problems when dealing with other real people. And the other people who read my book will even be able to do even better, because but I mean, even if no one else has read the book, you'll still do better. And then he says, this isn't and notice this isn't bounded rationality. This is completely different from what Paul was saying when he talks about heuristics as means of economizing on information. These are, what he's saying is these are problems that don't have a rational solution in standard terms. They do have a pragmatic solution. And he says, a theory of rationality ought to be able to give you better results than you could do without it. And that seemed like pretty obvious. I mean, it's a really good thought. And what he's doing is producing, and again, it fits in with this notion of the social. He's explaining how you go about coordinating with other people, relying on the cues as well. So I know all I'm really trying to say is that I don't think this, I mean, it hasn't been the mainstream view in economics. It still isn't, but I don't think it's a kind of like brilliant insight of the present. It's something that people who've thought seriously about it have been saying for, well, that's at least 60 years, So anyway, there we go. Good old Schelling.
Well, if I can react to it, yes, no, I totally agree that to a certain extent, the keen and self-honest observer sort of, would have been able to come up with this centuries ago. In that sense, that there is indeed nothing new under the sun, because we're talking about the analysis of people in group, and that will be thousands of years old. I mean, if I ask myself as to why I became convinced of this, because I read a neuroscience book, and that sort of told me, okay, much of how I'm taught that people think is clearly not how we do it, right? There's a lot of uncertainty there, but it's clear that everybody else is wrong, at least as well. But I have another remark to make, that the part of the point, and this I suppose will be Gert's point of sort of taking heuristics seriously, is that you want to become scientific about the shortcuts, if you like, which shortcuts for what, and test whether they're better and run them off against another shortcut, right? You can sort of, you can still get to better outcomes. But there is another point I would like to make, which is that this whole notion of shortcut has a notion of a proper route in it. Whereas at least I've come to view how humans think as all shortcuts. There's no such thing as proper route. There's now that just doesn't exist. Neither is it possible, but it's sort of like it's made up. It's kind of like the story made up of lots and lots of shortcuts, if you like, right? I mean,
what's really interesting to me though about Schelling is that this isn't a shortcut. It's saying it's a deeper argument actually. It's saying, well, when you look at the theory of rationality, the theory of rationality can't do as well as intuition in these particular problems, and so the heuristic is telling you a heuristic, but the heuristic is not a shortcut to the rational. It's the truly rational. And not irrespective of cost. There's no cost to do. It's not that true rationality is costly. It's that it's wrong. I mean, it's not standard rationality.
But no, but I mean, I hence have maybe a particular definition of what I think of as rational, right? If you think of a shortcut as to the truth, if you like, right, then that would then be clearer, right, as to what is the shortest route, for instance, right? But I think, yeah, we are in agreement on that, and of course, he's not alone. I know that Reinhard Selten also sort of did experiments in a certain moment, abandoned the whole sort of econ rationality story for, well, how do you behave in very strange games? And then he set up a whole procedure for like, oh, well, if you think that way, that sounds rather rational, right? He also started to approach it from that direction. It was like, okay, how do people actually play inside a lab? It's clearly not how we pretend they play, right?
I mean, I'll let Gert come in a second, but I mean, it wasn't Herbert Simon sort of arguing the same sorts of stuff as well in the 50s. But I don't think, I mean, I don't know what Bob's view is, but for me, it's still very useful to return to this sort of stuff and emphasize it because, if you do believe in the approach at least, because it's the alternatives, isn't it? It's the rationality that's dominant. So, if there is, I mean, I suppose that goes to my question to Gert at the beginning. Does he see like sort of an increasing interest in these types of arguments? They have still been very much the minority view over time, aren't they? And they still are now, I think. But is there a sort of an increasing groundswell that will make it so that maybe in 300 years' time, economic rationality, so to speak, will be consigned to sort of history? It will be considered to be one of these kind of almost dead sciences.
Well, I know that as an approach, it's clearly undertaken, but I mean, I've at least come to sort of view it as bizarre. I mean, you can say it's mainstream, but I mean, to some extent, it's now so far from cognitive psychology and neuroscience that it's like seeing some faraway tribe still pretending, that some sort of old defunct god is still alive and walking among them. I mean, it really starts to look bizarre after a while, and the fact that it's mainstream in a certain sense just means, oh, well, so many people are not doing something sensible anymore. More room to maneuver for others. Right?
Let's just let Gerd come in because I think he probably wants to say something in response to the other.
Yeah, there were a number of questions so far. I'll start with the last one. So, what is Reinhard Selten's view on? So I knew him very well, and he was someone who could separate situations of risk, so risk in the sense of savage small worlds where we know everything that can happen in the future, all the consequences and probabilities, and models for that. That was his mathematical side. He could separate this from the real world situations, which is something that is often confused. So if I prove that something is optimal, for instance, in his example of this supermarket chains, where a competitor is entering and you have 20 supermarkets in 20 cities, so you have to decide whether to be nice or not. So he proved that it's optimal to be nice, but he said, of course, I wouldn't do that in the real world, because he understood this situation that he's proving has probably very little to do with all the uncertainties in the real world. He was very clear about there are two different situations, and his heart was in finding out how actual people make decisions in an uncertain world. And So Simon had a similar a distinction that he, at least after he learned at his training at the University of Chicago, he learned expected utility maximization. Then when he went into actual working at his Minnesota home department on managing problems and budget allocations, he learned, in his words, expected utility maximization is ridiculous. So it doesn't apply there. And to add a third person who made this distinction, and unlikely maybe for some of you, is Jimmy Savage. Jimmy Savage was responsible for, or one of the first ones who put a normative interpretation to expected utility maximization the Bayesian way. But he had a caveat. He said it only works for small worlds. And a small world is like a lottery, where you know everything, every future event that can happen and every outcome. And he said, also his term, it would be ridiculous to apply this to real world problems, such as, he gave one example, planning a picnic. Something unexpected could happen and you don't have it in your probability distribution. So what I want to say, there are a number of eminent thinkers who have made a distinction between what I call situations of uncertainty, where the state space isn't known and not knowable, and it's not a shortcut, and situations where we can optimize, where we can use the expected utility calculus. So that's also, I think, would be my answer to Nick's concern. Nick's concern about consistency, and he asked rightly, shall we throw it away? The consistency type of rationality, or to speak with Herbert Simon's metaphor of the two scissors, two blades of a pair of scissors, cognition and environment, as you put it. So the typical rationality theories in economics are one-bladed. It's only about internal consistency and Bayesian probability updating. They are not two-bladed. So my point of view, I started where Herbert Simon left us. And for me, rationality is about success in the world. So that means one needs to look at both at, say, the heuristic that's being used, that people know, apply, be it social or otherwise, and the problem and the type of clustering. And then one can do precise results. And if I understood Nick correctly, he also worries about that could be a hodgepodge of everything, that the adaptive toolkit. It is, to a certain extent, it is more than one rationality. But there we have very precise proofs about situations where, for instance, relying on a single Q type of heuristic cannot be beaten by an entire logistic regression relying on that Q and many, many more. And that can be done. We just need more people who think about figuring out the conditions where something works and where not. And so these are some of the works. Schelling, of course, would be, I love to read him. And so I just, let me see on my notes here. So one point on consistency. Consistency, as it's defined in expected utility theory and in the axioms, requires to be consistent about every option, and not just consistent between the two thoughts that you just have. That's an important distinction. And this is not a rationality for mortals, because often you don't have the time, or you just would waste time just to be consistent and transitive and try to find that out. And so I'll leave it with this. I wouldn't worry about consistency. Sometimes consistency is functional, for instance, being consistent with your friends, but sometimes it is of advantage to be not consistent, such as if you are in a dealing with enemies. You don't want to be predictable. And that's also Schelling's point. Thanks.
Thank you, Gerd. Giuseppe, I think you had your hand up next. Do you want to come in?
Yes. Well, it's difficult to formulate a kind of comment now after this very high-level exchange, but I'm totally sold on the idea of exploring the sort of locally optimized rationality. And in the previous seminar that we had, where I had the chance to discuss a bit of my take on this, is that which basically was on using computational methods to explore heterogeneity. In that particular case was about treatment effects, but my take is really that in order to find this local optimized version of rationality, or to put it another way, this non-random distribution of heuristics that you find in many data, is what is the level, I mean, what is the notion that we might need to find a bit of stability and consistency? I put forward this idea of the behavioral niche coming a bit from evolutionary biology, but I'm not sure how sort of fit is. But the idea is, we have some kind of model and deviation from that model that becomes locally optimized, or we need to think about different models of decision making that appears to be locally optimized. Because empirically, the first one, using machine learning, using several approaches, is doable. The second is really tricky. It is about making different models competing against each other. I mean, some people do that in, especially in AI and sort of these sort of approaches. So I'm really, I suppose, throwing the point out there in what is your take on this? Because I'm exploring the first one with to the best of my knowledge, but the second one is really tricky in essentially having to deal with a model space of potential different either heuristics that you need to explore. And I assume using algorithms for that is very useful, but also leads to this potentially sort of n of spaces that you need to explore. You don't know how to select. I mean, but again, to go back to my first comment, the idea here would be, what is the local level that we should aim at when we look for this local optimization of usage of heuristics? Because I tend to be data driven into this. I try to find it locally from my data, but I also see the point in trying to find some local that has stability. I use this term niche to try to find some kind of socio-ecological characteristics that can be persistent over time. But again, I'm completely open to discuss this from your insights. Thanks.
Shall I go, Adam, or would you like Gerd to answer?
Oh yeah, you go, Paul. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. How do I see this? I think I see where you're coming from. I mean, I've been a long time econometrician, and I've also spent many years, as it were, staring from in the model world at all kinds of questions, wondering how would this work in the model world. So I think the most important thing I can say on that is that if you're thinking of this as a new discipline, and I'm thinking of this as a new discipline, this approach, right? And I don't know if it's Frijters, but I am. Then your master language is neither models, nor maths, nor even optimization. Your master language is more history, anthropology, business, actual organizations. And so it is, as it were, learning to recognize social situations, money situations, problem situations, and starting to become sort of comfortable with the notion of these toolboxes. And these toolboxes can be varied. Just, how does a conversation start? How do three people see more than one? How do they team up for something? The point of using randomness in allocations, how you go against cheating, the notion that people take turns, the notion of sort of a race, of a competition, and lots and lots and lots of these things that we use in real life, which includes, of course, leadership, followership, all kinds of roles within groups. And so that is, as it were, the orientation space, right? Okay, what have other humans done in different situations? What in various cultures has been the way that they've dealt with certain problems? What kind of cognitive, emotional developments have taken place? And it is the afterthought within that kind of setup to think of, okay, can we now try and formalize some of this in as it were, an environment? Because then you know where the niche is. You've got the ecology in your mind with all these examples that happened before in history, where things might go and what your essential toolkit is. And then, well, you try to, as it were, optimize. And for that, models and data start to be useful again, which is, well, okay, well, what about this particular situation? Because the point of these models and niches are then, well, can we think of another tool, right? And modeling can, in that sense, be very creative. You can come up with something that is hard to perhaps come up with if you're just in the middle of the ecology, so obsessed with the problem directly at hand. So I view it more as that one has to get away from the notion that models, maths, are the master language, right? The master language has to be this narratives of how have humans lived, how have they solved problems individually and collectively, what they've done in various situations. And from then, formalism is just another tool, right? And so then as it were, the answers slot in rather naturally, right? It was just, do we actually need a tool for this, or does this always seem to work? In which case, there's no real puzzle. That's more where I'm then coming from, right? But I have hence shifted totally from the model world in which I was raised to more this narrative, historical, anthropological business world in which there is a huge toolbox out there, but in various ways have been combined, perfected, and changed according to the problems at hand.
Okay, so Alejandro, I think you have the last question today, and then Paul and Gert can have an opportunity to respond because we need to finish by the hour. So Alejandro, do you want to?
Yeah, very quick. I think that when Herbert Simon in the 1950s publishes administrative behavior, it starts to coin, uses the concept limited rationality, and then he quickly changes to bounded for specific reasons, because it is bounded. Okay, so it's not limited, it's not negative. And he does that because, and this is my quick comment and a question, he does that because he starts to understand that the reality of decision-making does not match the Olympian rationality. And it is Olympian because it does not exist. And the lack of existence, I wonder if it's something that may affect economic as a science. And sorry for my dogs. Economic as a science, at the moment that introduces the reality of decision-making, is becoming psychology. And I wonder if this is affecting how we see both sciences. And to go back to the idea of Adam about the economic rationality in a couple of centuries, I wonder if economic rationality is just psychological rationality, and the discipline, as economics, is just kind of like melting itself, maybe as a branch, and there is a type of propulsion and in order to justify what economics are doing, and not on purpose, of course. I'm not saying ad hoc. I'm saying as a something that comes from the economic science itself. And very quick, also 1 minute. If we go back to Plato and the idea of the allegory of the cave, I think it looks like that the perfect rationality model, it is what happens to the soul when the soul abandons the cave and is no longer in a world. It is in a world that does not exist with a body that does not exist. So when I see the perfect rationality model, it looks like that idea of soul in Plato when it is no longer in the cave. And I don't know. I mean, is this a matter of sciences and divisions? Could it be? I'll leave it there.
If I respond to that, yes, I'm not sure that the sole direction is very empirical, if you like, right? Now, I'm not an economic historian, but my understanding is that this whole, as it were, obsession with rationality sort of came in a long time ago, 2.5 centuries or so, and then, you know, what was advocated, particularly by people who were sort of in business deals, as well, this is the smart way, this is how you get ahead, right? And you should think more like this. So started as normative, as it were, predictive. Well, try and be like this, try and think through things, and then you won't go bad. That started to be, you know, this sort of typical dynamic started to be mistaken for the truth, in which you had economists who couldn't even imagine that people were not like this, right? So it's almost like 2.5 centuries ago, some people said, well, you know, fish are successful, we should be more like fish. And then some people were dumb enough to sort of misunderstand that for what we actually were. We're fish. And now the behavioral economists are saying, well, we're fish, but we've got a lot of ape-like tendencies. And I would like us to just accept that we're apes, if I would put it in another allegory, not of the cave, perhaps. But that's my understanding. Basically, this was made up. It was a myth. But of course, it was a useful myth, right? And there's probably still, in that sense, power in the myth.
Yeah.
But it's so unrealistic. I mean, it's bloody hell.
Okay, let's give. I think most behavioral economists might be saying we're not like fish, but they're still saying we should still eat fish food.
Nice.
To give the last minute to Gerd, just 1 minute, Gerd, if you don't mind, because we're on. Yeah,
I'll be short. What's now the mainstream in behavioral economics has not challenged the norms. So expected utility maximization, the axioms and Bayesian updating is still a norm for every situation. It's the old Leibniz dream. There could be one solution for all problems. And I would wish that we have the courage to go one step further and challenge the norms in the sense that we ask, when is consistency functional and when is it not? When is Bayesian updating functional and when is it not? If the future is not like the past, then you can't just update the probabilities. So these are the type of questions. And then we would have a new behavioral economics that is not, doesn't see its task as to see whether human judgment deviates from the old logical rationality, but takes human judgment seriously and asks a different question. Is that a good heuristic? Is that a good way to be a social animal? And also, is it a good way to be part of a democracy?
that was great. That was wonderful. I mean, I loved this seminar. Thank you so much to Paul and Gert and all of the questions. This is the sort of ideal, I think, what we had in mind, Tim Besley and I, when we established the behavioral public policy seminar series. So it was really, really great. Thank you both very much.